Our next speaker, Nasim Ahmed. He is senior researcher at the Palestinian Return Center, editor of the Journal of Palestinian Refugee Studies, and author of the book Understanding the Palestinian Nakba. So he will talk about the Palestinians that have already been displaced and the rest of the situation. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you all for coming. I'm actually honored and privileged to be sitting with Richard Falk, someone who's been so brave and courageous defending the Palestinian cause and human rights around the world. I'd like to thank all the delegations and the representatives of all the various NGOs and organizations that have come here. I initially was going to talk about the Syrian Revolution, but I've had to adapt my presentation. And I think when having listened to Amal, one thing that comes out clear is that the state of constant violence and tragedy is one of the saddest hallmarks and characteristics of the Palestinian people. That's something which is experienced over and over again. And for some Palestinians, even before they're able to digest one tragedy, another tragedy comes and befalls them. And I think one of the universal themes which Amal touched upon is that the lack of protection of Palestinians within West Bank and also Palestinians around the world. Within West Bank, because the Israeli authorities are prejudiced and discriminate against Palestinians on various levels, and also Palestinian refugees around the world who do not have the proper umbrella protection from international law. And this will be highlighted through my presentation of the Syrian Revolution and the experiences of Palestinians from Syria. And as you know, the Palestinians from Syria are suffering the same kind of cycle of violence, tragedy which befell the Palestinians from Iraq in 2003. These are the same groups who were expelled in 1948. They settled in the surrounding countries, and they moved from one expulsion to another expulsion. And in a more recent time, we saw in 2003 where nearly 20,000 Palestinians had to flee the sectarian violence because they did not have the umbrella of protection from international law and also the various countries in the region. And this again is something we're seeing with Palestinians in Syria. With the sectarian violence, again, nearly 40,000 Palestinians have been expelled and 500,000, nearly 200,000 Palestinians displaced within Syria. Of course, I mean, one might, of course, say, why are we talking about Palestinians from Syria, given that Syria is such a great, complex conflict? But I think we need to look at the Syrian issue and look at the lack of protection which Palestinians face and ask what is the end product for the Palestinians in the diaspora, Palestinians who are refugees in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon. If Israeli settlers are incapable of living with Palestinians already in Palestine, what hope is there for Palestinians in the diaspora? What hope is there of the Palestinians in the various 7 million Palestinians we're talking about, refugees who are around the world, who are wishing one day to return to their country, return to their land, which is their right by international law? What hope is there if Israel claims absolute right to the land, if Jews claim absolute right to the land, and enact policies and enact discriminatory policies to prevent, to continue expulsion, to continue dispossession, to continue ethnic cleansing, which they carried out in 1948. If that is still the policy, what hope is there for the two-state solution? What hope is there for peace? Unless, of course, there is a holistic way to address the expulsion in the West Bank, in Hebron, in Jerusalem, and dismantle the apparatus, discriminatory apparatus that prevents also the return of Palestinians to their land. But I think with the Syrian case also, we can say that by looking at it, it gives us the true extent of the political failures of the international community with regards to the Palestinians, as I will go on to show. And it also attunes us to the insecurities Palestinians feel throughout the Middle East and around the world. And again, we can also, by looking at the Syrian crisis, identify the failures of the existing refugee structure, which has been designated or which has been set up to protect the rights and human rights of Palestinians in the diaspora. Let me start with the insecurities that come with settlements of with the insecurities that come with statelessness for Palestinians. This is, of course, the consequence of Israeli expulsion of Palestinians from their land, and Palestinians throughout the last 6 decades have felt being the brunt end or the brutal end of being stateless, and we saw that, of course, as I mentioned, in Iraq, before that in Kuwait, and more recently in Syria. In Syria, right at the beginning, blaming the victim, blaming the Palestinians for the political unrest was the easy way out. This was like the scapegoat. And the Syrian regime, right from the beginning, laid the blame on the Palestinians for the unrest. Palestinian refugee camps became the first front line for the regime to actually start their repression against the Syrian people. This early development for the Palestinians raised alarm, because they experienced what that meant when political unrest was blamed on them. This happened in Kuwait, this happened in Iraq. So when this kind of unrest happens and they blame the Palestinians, they automatically felt threatened. And the refugees in Daraa and in Al-Ramal neighborhood, which saw the first seeds of Palestinians feeling insecure and wanting to leave because they know the insecurities that come with being stateless in a very politically volatile and unstable country. And it was not really until demonstrations all around Syria that the blame on Palestinians actually dissipated, and the fact that this was an organic Syrian revolution came into the fore. But having said that, if you look at the consequences in terms of the impact of the Syrian revolution with regards to the number of people that have been expelled, the Palestinians, they are nearly 450 to 500,000 within the Syrian population. About 50%, nearly 250,000, have actually been displaced one way or another. And 3 million Syrians have been displaced in one way or another. That's 15% of the population. So here again we see a clear indication of how Palestinians always feel the brunt end of any kind of political unrest within the Middle East. 50%, as I said, have been forced to expel from Syria. And in Syria, Palestinians experience, remember, in Syria, Palestinians experienced the least discrimination. They were the most integrated of all the Palestinian communities in the Middle East. They intermarried. They had access to jobs. There was no discriminatory laws. They were welcome in Syria, and even then, with political unrest, they were the first to feel the rash, the wrath of the Syrian regime. And this tension, as I said, was played out within Palestinian communities in Syria. Because of the experiences they've had in Kuwait, in Iraq, having sometimes sided with the wrong political parties, there was tension within the Palestinian political organization as to who they should support or whether they should remain neutral. At the beginning, there was a strong urge to remain neutral because they feared what would happen if they actually feared the consequences, knowing what happened in Kuwait and Iraq. And as the Syrian Revolution progressed, Palestinians, like the Palestinian group Hamas, they decided to actually side with the Free Syrian Army, and they actually left Syria. Some Palestinian factions decided to actually support the regime. But overall, the Palestinian people, especially the ones in the diaspora, they remain neutral. They still remain neutral, and they insist that they only support the Syrian people, and they are not supporting any political party and any regime because of the fear that comes with being stateless, because of the repression that will come once there is a resolution to the Syrian crisis. And this also again exposes the failure within the, as I said, existing protection regime for the Palestinians. As you know, no other refugee community in the world is excluded from the kind of levels of protection which Palestinians are restricted from. UNRWA has played an essential part in assisting Palestinians to survive after the 1948 Nakba. They were set up to actually, as a humanitarian organization, temporarily knowing that Palestinians who were expelled in, say, for example, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq and Jordan, that very soon they will actually return to Palestine. They will return to their homeland in Palestine. But because Israel has continued to resist any kind of return of the Palestinians, that has not happened. But the perception that UNRWA actually looks after the Palestinians, that it protects all their rights en bloc, en masse, in a sense, it conceals the many failures within UNRWA, and the fact that it's actually in extreme pressure and suffering from extreme budget deficits, and no way provides the umbrella of protection which other refugees, even Syrian refugees, are allowed by UNHCR, or Afghanistan refugees and various other refugees. So Palestinians, in that sense, with regards to international law, they are marginalized in a way no other refugees are. And the practical manifestation of this is that Palestinians are treated differently at the borders. So where you'll have refugees streaming in from the same conflict, from the same war, Palestinians would be treated differently. They would be discriminated against. And if we look at, say, for example, in Jordan, there is a clear distinction in the way it treats refugees who are Syrian and refugees who are Palestinians. So Syrian nationals, for example, as soon as they establish their identity and they are passed the security check, they are automatically allowed to enter the country. Whereas Palestinians, they have no such provisions, and they will actually remain detained within the borders. And this creates scenarios where you have fathers who are, say, for example, Jordanian. They are allowed into the country, but his family and his children who are Palestinians, they are detained within the detention camp and not allowed to leave the detention camp. So this is not something unique. It's happening regularly, and we've had delegation going to these places, and they've discovered such incidences as well. Human Rights and Amnesty also reported these incidents as well. And remember, UNRWA also does not have the resource to actually accommodate such a surge. Like, for example, in Lebanon, where you have something like 40,000 Palestinians who have fled the Syrian war, they would actually face starvation within Lebanon if it wasn't for the existing Palestinian community in Lebanon. There are examples of families who are accommodating 20 or 30 people in a 2-bedroom house. You know, this is not new. It's a recurring thing. And if it wasn't for their courtesy, if it wasn't for the fact that they know what it feels like to be displaced, they know what it feels like to be expelled, if it wasn't for their kindness, UNRWA would not be able to pick up the pieces of 30,000, 40,000 refugees fleeing from Syria into Lebanon, which is already stretched, which is already overpopulated, and you have a scenario now where you have, as I said, sometimes 30, sometimes 40 living within a 2-bedroom accommodation. And this again also shows us the true extent of the political failures. The solution to the refugees, as we know, is for them to return to their country. This was the clear goal and vision of the international community passing UN Resolution 194. This is why UNCCP was set up initially, UNRWA was set up, so that temporarily they can identify what the losses were for the Palestinians, and soon they will return them to to their homes and land and reimburse them. And if the great powers had actually insisted on Israel to repatriate the Palestinian refugees after 1948, the Nakba in 1948, as was demanded, the refugee problem would not have happened. What would the Middle East have actually looked like if the Palestinian refugee problem was not there? What would Lebanon be like? You know, would we have had a Black September? Would we have the current 7 million Palestinians wandering without any kind of proper protection within the Middle East and around the world? Would that have happened? I know it's a counterfactual argument, but it shows that clearly there was a way to end the conflict even before, by repatriating the refugees, which was their basic human rights, and end the conflict there and then. But instead, as we see, we have an ongoing campaign of occupation and settlement and dispossession, and it's the same infrastructure that has continued to deny the same Palestinians to return to their land. So instead of enforcing human rights, Israel has made Palestinian return an impossibility. Not just in historical Palestine, you know, which is their actual right as a human right, but also in occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. How are Palestinians going to return if there is to be a two-state solution? How are Palestinians from Syria and Jordan, how are they supposed to return to an occupied Palestine which has been fragmented and which has been cantonized and taken over by Israeli settlers. So what we need really is for the international community to address the existing problem, to keep funding UNRWA and prevent the kind of strains and difficulties which Palestinians are experiencing. We need the US. We need the US to block its effort to divest UNRWA, because there is an effort within the USA to block further donations to UNRWA. US is the major donor there, and because of pressures from various lobbies and organizations, the United States is rethinking the money it gives to UNRWA. And the Arab nations need to stop, again, discriminating Palestinians on the borders and have a system where there is no discrimination between who we should detain, who we shouldn't detain. They're all coming from the same war zone, and there shouldn't be this level of discrimination. And I think temporarily again, we need to extend UNHCR's provision to include Palestine, because there are Palestinians who have actually gone as far as Hong Kong and China to actually escape this. We have contact with 100 families who have gone far afield as Hong Kong. But they don't have the access to the resources because they're Palestinians, and UNHCR needs to step in and help some of the Palestinians who are further afield and not directly in the Middle East. And ultimately, of course, we need international pressure on Israel to allow Palestinians to return to their home. That is really the only way and the ultimate way we can end this ongoing conflict. Thank you very much for listening.